Well, good morning and welcome to Elevenses with Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training. Good to be back after a unscheduled day in bed on Wednesday. Not feeling wonderful, but I'm sort of still alive and kicking this morning. So we've got a fairly packed show for you today. Some stuff that I've been thinking about putting in for a while, but finally got around to. But we also got some news, of course. The DVSA are seeking to increase examiner workload, as I believe we covered just a few days ago, and the union have now voted for strike or other industrial action. We'll have a look at that in a moment. Royal Enfield, their sales are on the up and up, and they've just landed their first European race championship since 1956, which is a fairly astonishing achievement. In Singapore, an e-scooter rider who crashed into a motorcyclist and caused the rider and passenger to fall off has received a hefty punishment, which we'll look at in a moment. We'll look at the watch to own if you ride, apparently, and then we'll cover today's talking point, which is where's the next round of development going in motorcycles. There's not much point in developing the internal combustion engine much further, I think. So my guess is rider aids, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. So good morning to everybody. Clive has said hello. Nice to see you. Right, so settle yourself down for the next 30 minutes or so whilst I look through those news stories. But before I go any further, just a reminder that I am looking to run my next Science of Being Seen presentation in just a few days' time. Science Being Seen is an internationally recognised and in-depth look at the SMIDSY, sorry mate, I didn't see you, collision, which actually dovetails neatly with the thinking point or the talking point that I'll be bringing up at the end of the show. Originally created for Kent Fire and Rescue's Biker Down course, it's a presentation that lasts around 45 minutes, and you'll discover why the driver has visual perception issues. You'll understand why conventional day riding lights and conspicuity aids aren't as effective as we might like to think, and we can also look at how to be proactive in the threat. So tickets are now available for this. It's on Wednesday, the 6th of October at 2000 hours, which is 8 p.m. in old money. And you can book your ticket here if you want to. I've just put up the wrong link. Let me just delete that and come back to the right one. 1 millisecond and I'll get it right. Just frustrating when you think you've got everything pre-prepared, ready to go, press the button and the wrong thing pops up. Right, you should have the link coming up on screen. If not, it's in the description. So do pop along if you want to find out more about the SMIDSY collision and what you can do about it. All right, okay, so that's Science of Being Seen. Back on the driving test front, you probably know that the DVSA have been planning to increase the number of tests run per day from 7 to 8, and they notified examiners that they would be going ahead with these plans from 11th of October. Now, that's despite opposition. So what has happened is that driving examiners and line managers who are members of the Public and Commercial Services Union, the PCS, they've actually voted to support industrial action. It was an 80% turnout. 95% of the members voted yes to industrial action short of a strike in defence of their working terms and conditions, and 92% have actually supported a strike. Now, according to my calculations, and assuming the overall working day remains the same, the gap between tests would be reduced to just 3 minutes. So in other words, basically an examiner would finish one test and immediately start on the next. Now, as I said at the time, when I heard those proposals, as an instructor myself, I know there's an awful lot more to assessing riding or driving than simply sitting back and enjoying the ride. Either as an instructor or a candidate, quite frankly, I'd be concerned that a tired examiner wouldn't be assessing my test correctly. And then there are the potential safety issues too. In both cases, the examiner is responsible for the learner's safety whilst out on the road. Now, back at the end of August, the DVSA said that they would be working hard with the PCS to resolve their concerns, and so clearly they failed. So the DVSA actually appear to have moved on to the offensive here, and they're playing the COVID guilt card. DVSA Chief Executive Loveday Ryder, yes, honestly, that is his name, said, "The country's endured so much as a result of COVID-19. We've been in regular discussion with the PCS on how we can support the recovery of our services. So it's disappointing that the PCS has chosen to take this course of action. Safely reducing driving test waiting times will contribute to the national recovery effort, and we're taking steps to provide thousands of learner drivers with the vital driving tests they need to access employment, education, health, and social activities." Well, okay, well, it's all very well. I mean, yes, reducing driving test waiting times is laudable, but it does have to be done safely. And clearly, there is a lot of debate about whether this measure is actually safe. The PCS say they're still open to working with the DVSA, and they actually are requesting a suspension of the new 8 test schedule. And they're going to be holding meetings with members at the end of this month. As a sort of by the by, there is one way that the test backlog could be resolved reasonably quickly, and that would be actually to stop putting marginal candidates in for the test. In fact, to wait until those candidates are good and ready and, no, I can't say guaranteed to pass, but have as good a chance as they possibly can. Everybody makes mistakes when being assessed, and some of them are, pretty random. But I know as a motorcycle trainer, you can get candidates to the point where they shouldn't do anything silly. Right at the moment, less than 50% of car tests end up as a first-time pass. And as I said, you soon know when a learner genuinely is at test standard. So it wouldn't actually be hard for the instructors to adjust here by upping the standards of the candidates they put forward. The downside, of course, is it would be more expensive for some learners, because right now some get away with a test pass when they're not really actually quite test standard. They just get lucky that nothing goes wrong on the day. But the fact is that of those test candidates that go in, more than 50% will be back taking those extra lessons and having to book a second test anyway. So there you go. There's an alternative thought. I'm sure it won't go down well with the driving instructor community, but hey ho, we have to think creatively. Also in the news are Royal Enfield, and they are on the up and up in the UK sales charts. Now, I meant to run this story actually some considerable time ago because it refers to the August sales figures. But anyway, the formerly British brands that have moved to India have come back to the UK, and they've become something of a surprise sales success over the last year or so. Back in June 2020, the Royal Enfield Interceptor 650 and the Continental GT outsold even Honda's PCX 125, which at the time was the best-selling small bike. And it was actually the UK's best-selling motorcycle according to MCIA data. It even pushed BMW's perennial GS off the top sales charts. So the question that I actually asked back then was it a one-off? Was it down to a large test fleet being registered? After all, motorcycle sales numbers aren't exactly huge, and you often see a blip as pre-orders are sold on and as test bikes also appear on the market. So here are the registration figures for August. The Enfield Himalayan, the little 400cc adventure bike, sold 97 units. Now, it doesn't sound a great deal, but it actually makes it the biggest selling adventure bike, although it's likely sales of the 1250 GS and the 1250 GS Adventure and the Tracer 900 and Tracer 900 GT would probably have outsold it if they'd be combined, but let's not take anything away from that achievement. 78 Interceptors were plated up in the newly minted modern classic category. That's more than any other bike in that class. And the final entry for Royal Enfield is the new Meteor 350 single, registering 136 machines. And that's 350 single topped the 126 to 650cc class. Now, to put those figures into perspective, the best-selling motorcycle was the NMAX 125 scooter from Yamaha that sold 271 units, or at least they were registered. Honda's perennial CBF 125, that was next on 175. And in third place, in 145, was the inexpensive Kiwi Superlight scooter. So the Meteor and Himalaya actually placed 4th and 5th in the charts. So why are they selling so well? Well, the Meteor is presumably a sort of an inexpensive lightweight retro. But the 650 Twins are also a bit of a bargain too. It's basically a brand new bike for 2/3 of the price of the base model retro from Triumph. Triumph's more powerful, but I honestly think that it's massively overpriced. So, okay, what else have Royal Enfield been up to? Well, just a moment while I remind you that if you have any comments, if you have any questions, do ask away. I'm always happy to respond while I'm on air. I'll try and get back to you at the end of the show as well, for sure. And if there's anything you ever want me to look at, drop me a line and I will try to answer your question. Okay, so Royal Enfield out on the tracks, they've been doing their thing too, and they have just won their first European Championship since 19. Let me just get the right picture up. I'm messing around with my mouse this morning. Since 1956, and that was the year that Johnny Britton won the ACU Star at the National Trials Championships back in that year. So it's 65 years, and it's their first year of competitive flat track competition on European soil, and they got a clean sweep in the Twins class category. Okay, now there probably aren't that many people competing on Twins, and it does seem that Royal Enfield have put in quite an effort. Teammates Gary Birtwistle and Paul Young, I'll come back to in a moment, took the checkered flag. They actually won all 5 rounds of racing, and they also finished in first and second place in the championship. Now, at the 5th and final round, which was at the Greenfield dirt track, it was all down to Young to secure the championship crown for Royal Enfield, because their principal rider Birtwistle, who'd won the first 3 races, had his season cut short when he broke a scaphoid in his wrist. Now, Paul Young, you may remember, he's actually a fairly experienced tarmac racer. Certainly raced at the top level of BSB, I think. So he's relatively new to flat track, apparently, but he took the win, and that meant he got the overall championship, and his team ended up winning the crown for the first time in 65 years. So hats off there to Royal Enfield. They really, really are making a big impact in the UK. Now, what would you expect to be punished with if you caused a crash involving another vehicle? Well, earlier this month in Singapore, a 26-year-old man pleaded guilty to causing grievous hurt to a motorcyclist through a negligent act of causing injury. What happened effectively was that Ito Wong was riding an illegal e-scooter when he crashed into a motorcycle and brought both the 55-year-old rider and his 26-year-old daughter down. The accident occurred in November 2018. He apparently switched lanes from left to right and hit the bike, and all 3 came down and all 3 suffered injuries. The court heard that the accused was fully aware that it was unlawful to ride his e-scooter on the road. Wong wasn't convicted solely of the motoring offences. He also pleaded guilty to charges of contravening a Moneylenders Act in connection with unlicensed money lending, and with criminal breach of trust. It seems he was siphoning off cash from customers whilst working as a delivery man. His sentence, 1 year and 11 weeks in jail, a fine of $30,000, which is just over £16,000, and 3 strokes of the cane. Now, if you ever wondered which brand of wristwatch was being worn by Richard Dreyfuss in the movie Jaws, and I have to admit that I'd A, never seen him wearing a wristwatch, and B, certainly hadn't wondered what make it was, it turns out it was a little-known Swiss-made Alster Nautiscape. Now, the original incarnation of Ulster went out of business soon after the movie. Obviously, they didn't spend as much time on product placement back then as manufacturers do now, so they clearly didn't benefit from the connection with a shark. Anyway, Scott Angus McFadden has purchased the rights to the company, and he relaunched the brand in 2014. So they've released a number of revival wristwatches based on that Nautoscape original, but the latest product is what is called the Motoscape 120, and this is the watch apparently that you need to own if you ride a motorcycle, at least according to some commentators. So let's take a look at it. There it is. What's so special about it? Well, if you look closely, you'll see, but it's a collaboration between somebody called Alan Farmelow, who is apparently a frequent motorcyclist and founder of the watch blog Beyond the Dial. And now I have to admit I hadn't heard of him either. Spotted the difference yet? Three hands don't look very awkward, do they? All right, okay, have a look. It's what's known as a destro crown orientation. All right, I didn't know what that meant either, so I had to look that up. But basically, it means the winder is on the opposite side. If you have a look at it, your own wristwatch, if you've got a windy up one, the winder would be on the right, because most people are designed to be worn on the left wrist by someone who is right-handed. So the winder is where your right hand, your dominant hand, can get to it. But in this case, it's designed to be worn on the right wrist, but the winder is reversed. Now, normally a destro watch apparently is worn on the other hand, so that the winder is on the correct side for the dominant hand of a left-handed person. But in this case, the reason for putting the winder on the left is that it doesn't dig into the back of your wrist when you wear it in the conventional position. All right, did you follow that? Well, hopefully. Have you ever had that problem? And I can't imagine I have. I did have one issue with a wristwatch, and that was when I fell off, and the metal strap actually took a big chunk out of the back of my wrist. I've still got the scar actually here, so I tend not to wear anything that's vaguely hard on my wrists now when I ride. And the 120, well, again, if you look closely, there's a foot per second equation actually in the middle of the watch. Let's just see if I can zoom in on it. It's just under the bit that says shock resistant there, and what it basically is it's telling you the equation for 120 miles per hour. Why are we interested in 120 miles per hour? Well, blogger Farmelow, he says that that's the speed that triggers spiritual experiences for him. Right, okay. Possibly more pertinent, it's actually likely to be a reference to Hunter S. Thompson's Hell's Angels, where it said the strange music begins. Now, the watch is luminous, and you'll be glad to know that it's waterproof to 300 meters. So if you do ride your bike off a bridge into a deep lake, you'll be able to time yourself to the bottom. None of this comes cheap, of course. £645 in the UK is the price you'll be paying. And to be frank, I would rather spend the cash on a tank of fuel or more and off riding. Damien has looked in and he said, any news from Norton as far as production yet? Damien from New Zealand. Morning, Damien. I can't actually answer that question. What I can do is make a mental note and have a look and see if I can actually come up with any answers for you. So I will see what's going on. I'll try and see what comes up in my news feed. I have featured stories from Norton fairly regularly, but nothing for the last month or so. Right, okay, so on to today's final point. The talking point, really. As you probably know, I get a news feed daily involving motorcycles. Stories range from, technical innovations right through to, of course, the rather more serious ones involving injury and death. And here's yesterday's toll, just to run through it. Norfolk police say a black Harley-Davidson motorcycle was in collision with a yellow Ford Transit van. Police closed Casterston Road in Stamford after van and motorbike crash. Motorcycle in hospital with serious injuries after a Maidenhead crash. The bike collided with a Volkswagen Golf. And it's not just in the UK this happens either. Police in Lethbridge, Toronto, searching for witnesses to a crash between an SUV and a motorbike. In Cayman in the West Indies, a motorcycle rider was killed after his motorcycle minivan collided. Police are investigating an early morning crash after a motorbike collided with a boat trailer in Brisbane. And they're not always entirely simple. There was a collision on the A41 in which a rider died, which reportedly involved not just a van but a cow. But you'll notice the common features of that collision. Each one involved another vehicle. It's likely that the vast majority of those were SMIDSY collisions, because when the details come out, they almost always are. There was just one other serious injury report yesterday, and that involved a collision on private land with a tree, presumably somebody doing some off-road riding. So it's a pretty horrifying toll, and every single day there are the same sorts of reports. So what can we do? Well, road safety is often said to revolve around three main threads, known as the 3 E's: education, engineering, and enforcement. Now let's start at the other end. Let's start with enforcement. Enforcement revolves around making us adhere to the rule book that we create for using the roads. We have a keep left convention here in the UK anyway. We have traffic signs and other controls. We have no passing zones, and of course we have speed limits. So enforcement is after the fact. We commit a transgression of the rules and then we get caught. And then we get punished. The problem is, as I said, the punishment isn't going to prevent the transgression in the first place. Taking away a license after the fact is too late. So what we're actually applying is something called a deterrent. Many years ago, George Savile, who was the first Marquess of Halifax, he lived between 1633 and 1695, he said, men are not hanged for stealing horses, but that horses may not be stolen. As you've probably guessed, apart from being a statesman and a writer, he was also a politician who sat first in the Commons and then in the House of Lords. And his words refer to the idea that there is a deterrent nature to capital punishment, the idea that if individuals understand their transgressions can result in the state taking their lives, they'll be deterred from engaging in such behaviour. The bloody code was the system of crimes in England in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was not referred to as such in its time, but the name was given to it later. And it was bestowed on it because it was a period at which there were a sharply increasing number of offences which could result in the death penalty, and in the number of people who were subsequently executed. Now, in 1688, there were just 50 offences on the statute book punishable by death, but that number had quadrupled in just under 100 years by 1776. It actually reached 220 by the end of the century. Now, does that remind you of the way that we keep inventing new rules that people can break whilst out riding and driving? It rather does me, actually. And does it work? Well, no, of course it didn't. It's closing the stable gate after the horse has been stolen. And nobody ever expects to get caught stealing horses, just like drivers still regularly break the rules. How many people who will subsequently listen to this podcast will actually have 2 speeding offences on their licence? My partner, unfortunately, is suffering from that right at this very moment, having carelessly driven through 2 speed limits and then through a camera. Now, of course, one of the problems with offences like careless driving is that you have to know that things could go wrong in order to avoid putting yourself or other people into potentially risky positions. So take the classic example: a corner goes wrong, the police report says riding or driving too fast for the conditions, but how did the rider or driver actually reach that point in order to crash just there? Having left home, if they didn't crash on the very first corner or the second or the third or the 300th, How could they possibly know in advance they were going to crash on the 301st? And if a driver spent 30 years behind the wheel and never missed spotting a motorcycle pulling out from a junction, what gives him a clue it's going to happen this morning? So it's easy to say that common sense will sort out these problems, but in fact, when we start to assume that what usually goes right will always go right, that's when we get things wrong. We lose sight of what's called sometimes the error modes, which are the ways that even the simplest, most straightforward actions can break down until we receive a shock and a reminder that yes, it is possible to get a simple action which nearly always goes right wrong. So this is a role for education, but look at how the vast majority of rider education is conducted. It's all about if you do things right, nothing will go wrong. Nothing, ever. We should know better than that. I have to refer you to statements such as wearing high vis and drivers will see you. We see it all the time, and we should know by now how that's likely to end. So I see my role not just trying to show riders a prudent way of riding, which builds in an understanding of when driver and rider error can happen, so we have a better understanding of when it occurs and what we can do about it, but also in trying to kickstart a movement away from complacency in road safety generally. Does it work? I think there are signs, but I think we're still a long way from persuading everyone, and there'll certainly be a resistance to the idea that we should be taking responsibility for our own safety on a motorcycle. Hanging a horse thief is still a very powerful argument, even if you've already lost your horse. So that leaves engineering. Well, what can we do there? Well, we can tweak the rules. We can put up more traffic signs giving orders and restricting movements. We can insert traffic controls at barriers. We can create miles of no passing lanes. And we can put speed limits in, which will lower over the entire road network. And we can do things like segregate traffic. We can either make single carriageways into dual carriageways, or we can create low or no traffic zones, keeping motorized vehicles away from areas with lots of pedestrians and cyclists. And of course, we can engineer in enforcement too, those cameras I was referring to a moment ago. But there's nothing there that addresses the basic issue of the SMIDSY collision, which is human error. And this is the interesting thing, because a couple of other less depressing news items also popped up in my timeline. Honda, for starters, has filed patents for a camera that will fit neatly into motorcycle headlights, so it'll basically be almost indetectable from the outside. And Piaggio have just signed a deal for radar-on-chip rider aid systems. Now, Simon Hancock's, who's writing for Visedown, also spotted the Piaggio news, and he did actually make a couple of interesting comments. And first of all, he set the background. Basically, what he says is there's been a 15 to 21% increase in motorcycle collisions and fatalities over the past decade. Now, does that mean roads are getting more dangerous, or does it just reflect increasing motorcycle use? It's possibly a bit of both. Mostly, I would suspect, increased rider usage. Then he made an insightful statement. What he said was the most at-risk road users, i.e. motorcyclists and cyclists, currently receive the least regulatory and technical protection. Motorcycle safety has essentially remained unchanged for 40 years. The landmark Hertz report, that was end of the 70s, early 80s, inspired only a series of training and education programs, and even today, there's no equivalent of the National Highway Transport NHTSA, it's the US Standards Association, or the Euro NCAP, which is the collision testing for vehicles in Europe. There's no equivalent of those standards for two-wheelers. So any idea why? Well, do you think the resistance of riders to new ideas might have something to do with it? Take the seatbelt, for example. You may be surprised to learn that the very first versions were actually used in gliders as early as the late 1980s, and the very first cars just a couple of decades later. But it was mainly to stop people falling out. Orville Wright, for example, was buckled in mainly to ensure he could use the controls on the first flight of a powered aircraft at Kitty Hawk. By the 1950s, pilots and racing drivers were wearing harnesses, and the first rudimentary lap belts were appearing in passenger cars. In 1959, a Volvo engineer invented the modern three-point seatbelt. Volvo actually donated the patent, incidentally, but it wasn't until 1983, So that is 24 years later, almost a quarter of a century, that they became compulsory in the UK. Now, manufacturers had been installing seatbelts since 1965, but the law didn't come in for another 18 years. And it was to be another 8 years before that law was extended to backseat passengers. So when you look at the dates involved and you work out when seatbelts were invented and when that actually became a legal requirement, you'll see what a time lag there was. So there's a real inertia to adopting safety aids like helmets, like motorcycle ABS. In the car world, we have already, and prepare for a barrage of abbreviations, ADAS, Advanced Driver Assistance Systems, blind spot detection, which is BSD, lane change assist, LCA, front and rear collision warnings, which oddly enough is FRCW, and adaptive cruise control, which you're probably going to guess is ACC. But as Hancock's pointed out, motorcycles to date have largely missed out. He says there's a clear and growing need for split-second sensing that prevents collisions. The rising popularity of motorcycles and rapid advances in sensing technology present an unprecedented opportunity to evolve new systems that improve rider safety and lives. Now, it's not to say that these developments haven't already started to appear. There are models on the market, the Multistrada V4, BMW's R1250RT and R1800B, KTM's 1290 Adventure S, which all now are beginning to feature this kind of technology. But, and it's a huge but, those bikes represent a tiny, tiny fragment of the market because they are far removed from the bikes that the vast majority of riders actually use. So what is happening out there? What were the two stories? Well, the first one was that Honda have patented an interesting looking camera sensor. The only report on I have it right now is a bit hard to read. I suspect the writer struggled with the original source, but as I understand it, it's not radar based. The patent actually depicts the presence of stereo cameras, which use well-known technology, CCDs, MOS or CMOS, the sort of things you'd find in a pretty standard digital camera, actually. And the cameras are mounted actually inside the headlights, but shielded by internal walls to block light from the LEDs. Now, this isn't a new idea, but till now, this idea of using image sensors to assess distance to objects has only been used by car manufacturers. Subaru is an example. The article pointed out that camera-based sensors have shortcomings. They're negatively impacted by fog, spray and rain, but because they are color sensitive, they can do things like sense traffic lights and brake lights coming on the vehicle ahead. Now, the problem with these advanced driver assistance systems or advanced rider assistance systems for motorcycles is that they have to contend with a wide range of challenges and are specific to two-wheelers. Now, one challenge is that there's a lack of restraint on the rider. Right now, of course, the car driver is actually physically strapped into his seat. But if the automatic braking kicked in on the motorcycle, there's a real risk that the rider could actually lose physical contact with the bike. I've had a hand slip off a handlebar when I've hit a bump, for example, or they could fall off completely. And of course, that's just upright. What about hitting the brakes when leaned over? That is not a negligible problem to solve. And even passive warnings, which have been proposed and possibly where most of the work is likely to go ahead, that use lights, vibrational sound, when those go off very suddenly, they can be a shock to the rider. They can actually freeze a response. So the system needs to actually detect a threat as early as possible to enable either rider intervention or autonomous action. And that requires detection at long ranges, longer than cars. Over 100 meters is being quoted, with high sensitivity, precise imaging and lightning fast computation. Size also matters. There's a technological challenge to fit compact sensors into confined spaces, but there's another issue too. The larger size of passenger vehicles means that their sensors can be put on the periphery of the vehicle, and they can get better lines of sight past obstructions. Just like the rider following another vehicle has a restricted line of sight, the hardware on a motorcycle is tight into the center line of the bike, and it's likely to have the same out of sight issues as the rider. And there's cost. Motorcycles are lower volume, there are lower profit margins on the average motorcycle, and that's why the current tech is only appearing on the highest end machines, where volume sales don't actually matter that much. So this is where the second report comes in. And this is all about something called 4D imaging radar, and it's by a company called VAR. And basically what they've done is that they have managed to put the imaging radar onto a single chip, and this will be ready for production early next year. And they say that their platform is not only affordable, it offers a system which is robust in all conditions, doesn't require a line of sight, being radar based, and reliably detects presence, distance, direction, and speed, and is best in class, equivalent to best in class of the fitments to cars. Crucially, it's affordable enough to provide protection to all riders, they say. And that's why likely been taken up by Piaggio, who are one of the biggest manufacturers of lightweight motorcycles around. Now, an ideal solution would be to have cameras and radars working together, and that's something we're likely to see coming soon. But this does give us an indication, whilst development of the internal combustion engine is stalled, of I think where we're going to see the majority of changes to motorcycles coming over the next couple of years. So that's pretty much it for today. I'll just wind down. Don't forget, training courses are still available through September. I'm taking bookings into October right now. Evening courses, too late for those now. We finished with them until next year, but we're still running courses during the daytime. And don't forget, we do have a weather guarantee. You can book a course safe in the knowledge that if the weather turns pants on the day, we can reschedule for no cost. All right, okay, that's it for another show. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you again hopefully for the next show on Wednesday. So